Imagine the soft light of early morning spreading across the rolling hills of northern Mississippi. The year is 1867, and the air carries the scent of damp earth and wild honeysuckle. In the small town of Holly Springs, the streets are still quiet, lined with modest wooden houses and towering oak trees whose leaves whisper in the gentle breeze. A rooster crows somewhere in the distance, and the first golden rays of sunlight stream through the window of a simple, whitewashed cottage. Inside, a 5-year-old girl named Ida Bell Wells stirs in her bed, her eyes opening to the promise of a new day. The war that ended slavery is only 2 years past, and for this child born into bondage, the world feels newly spacious, filled with a quiet sense of possibility. She climbs out of bed and pads across the scrubbed pine floor, drawn to the window to watch the sunrise paint the clouds in shades of rose and amber. Downstairs, the aroma of cornbread and boiling coffee drifts up from the kitchen. Ida's mother, Elizabeth, is already at work, her hands moving with a practiced rhythm as she stokes the cast-iron stove. Elizabeth was a cook before emancipation, and now she brings that same meticulous care to her own home, her strength woven into every meal. The kitchen is a warm sanctuary, its walls lined with shelves holding clay pots and jars of dried herbs. Light enters through a small window above the wash basin, catching the steam that rises from the kettle. Ida soon joins her, and the two share a quiet moment, mother tying back the little girl's hair while humming an old spiritual. Outside, they can hear the sound of a saw biting into wood. Ida's father, James Wells, is already working in his carpentry shop beside the house, his tools laid out on a long bench beneath the shade of a pecan tree. James Wells was a man of principle and skill, a carpenter who had purchased his own tools and established a quiet reputation around town. He was also a trustee of the newly founded Shaw University, later known as Rust College, a school established on the site of a former slave market to educate freedmen and their children. In the workshop, light filters through gaps in the wooden walls, illuminating floating particles of sawdust that dance like tiny stars. Ida loves to sit on a stool and watch her father work, the plane gliding over rough timber, transforming it into something smooth and beautiful. As he works, he talks to her about politics, about the importance of reading, about a future where her voice will matter. He is not a loud man, but his quiet conviction fills the small workshop with a steady, reassuring light. When Ida is old enough, she walks each morning to the campus of Shaw University. The brick buildings sit on a gentle rise of land, surrounded by ancient oaks draped in Spanish moss that sway like soft curtains in the warm air. The school bell rings with a clear, honest tone, and children gather in the yard, their voices a low murmur of greeting. Ida takes her seat in a classroom where sunlight streams through tall, narrow windows, illuminating the wooden desks arranged in neat rows. A map of the world hangs on the plaster wall, and the chalkboard carries the faint ghost of the previous day's lessons. She is an insatiable reader, her small fingers tracing the lines of scripture and Shakespeare with equal wonder. In this room, surrounded by the scent of chalk dust and old paper, the rough edges of the world feel far away. Outside the classroom, the town of Holly Springs moves at the measured pace of rural life. Horse-drawn wagons roll slowly along the unpaved main street, their drivers nodding to passers-by. A blacksmith's hammer rings from an open shed, and women gather at the general store, their market baskets balanced on their hips. In a vacant lot, a game of marbles clinks softly, and an old man sits on a porch, whittling a piece of cedar into the shape of a bird. The entire scene is bathed in the hazy gold of late afternoon, a quiet tapestry of resilience and community. Young Ida walks through these streets with a book tucked under her arm, her footsteps steady and deliberate. She already carries within her a profound sense of right and wrong, a seed planted by her parents that will one day grow into an unshakable tree. Evenings in the Wells household are a sacred time. After supper, when the dishes have been washed and put away, the family gathers in the small parlor lit by a single oil lamp. The flames flicker inside the glass chimney, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. James opens the family Bible, its leather cover soft from years of handling, and reads aloud in a deep, resonant voice. Elizabeth sits in her rocking chair, mending a torn dress, the needle glinting with each stitch. Ida listens intently, the words settling into her memory like seeds in good soil. There is no clock ticking loudly, no urgency, just the slow, steady passage of a peaceful evening. Outside, crickets begin their nightly chorus and a full moon rises over the treetops, washing the landscape in a cool, silver light. This idyllic childhood, however, was visited by the shadow of fever. In the late 1870s, a yellow fever epidemic swept through the Mississippi Valley, and Holly Springs was not spared. The sunlight seemed to grow thin and fragile, and an uneasy quiet settled over the town. Ida, now 16 and away visiting her grandmother, was shielded from the worst, but when she returned home, she discovered an altered world. Both of her parents and her youngest brother had been taken by the sickness. The house that had been full of sawdust and Bible verses was now achingly still. The pecan tree still stood, the workbench still held its tools, but the two guiding lights of her life had gone out. Standing in that empty parlor, dust motes floating through the silence, Ida B. Wells made a quiet decision that would define the rest of her life. She did not allow the stillness to become an ending. Instead, she straightened her shoulders, adjusted her simple dress, and walked to the courthouse to seek guardianship of her 5 surviving siblings. She found work as a schoolteacher in a rural country school, taking up the chalk and the pointer her father had so valued. The young woman who had once traced the words of the Bible by lamplight now became the keeper of the lamp herself. On the last morning before her new life began, she stood once more at her childhood window, watching the sunrise. The light was the same golden hue she had known all her life, steady and true, and in its warmth, she found the strength to step forward into the unknown. Picture a narrow dirt road winding through the cotton fields of rural Mississippi, the morning sky a soft wash of lavender and pale blue. A young woman rides in a mule-drawn cart, a worn leather satchel resting on her lap. She is only 16 years old, but her posture is that of someone much older. This is Ida B. Wells, traveling 6 miles to the wooden one-room schoolhouse, where she will take on the role of teacher. The cart rocks gently with the rhythm of the mule's hooves, and all around her, the cotton bolls gleam white against the dark green leaves. The air smells of fresh-turned soil and wildflowers. As she approaches the school, she sees a simple, unpainted building standing alone in a clearing, its only ornament a small, cast-iron bell hanging near the door. This humble structure, warmed by the rising sun, is where she will shape young minds while barely a woman herself. Inside the schoolhouse, the light slants through 4 square windows, cutting bright rectangles across the unfinished pine floorboards. 2 rows of wooden benches face a plain pine desk that serves as her lectern, and behind it, a broad slate chalkboard fills most of the wall. There is no fireplace, only a small pot-bellied stove in the corner that will hold a fire during the colder months. Ida arranges her slate and chalk, her few shared textbooks, and takes a deep breath. The children arrive one by one, their bare feet padding softly across the threshold, their ages ranging from 6 to 16. She greets each child with a gentle nod, and they settle onto their benches, the boys on one side and the girls on the other. The room smells of chalk, sun-warmed wood, and the faint, sweet fragrance of the children themselves. Teaching in such a place required immense creativity. She taught reading, writing, arithmetic, and history, often all at the same time, moving between the different age groups like a quiet breeze. Her voice was calm but firm, and never sharp. She would read aloud from a book of poems, her words painting pictures of faraway oceans and forests, and the children would listen in perfect stillness, their eyes wide. Outside the open windows, a mockingbird might sing its borrowed songs, and sometimes a soft breeze would stir the papers on her desk. Ida learned to use the world around her as a textbook, pointing to the way the light grew shorter in autumn or the patterns of veins on a leaf. In this simple room, she discovered that her true talent was not just for conveying facts, but for kindling curiosity, a small, steady flame in each child. Afternoons at the schoolhouse carried a drowsy, honeyed quality. The sun would move across the sky and pour through the western windows, gilding the chalk dust that hung in the air. The students would bend over their slates, making careful strokes with their slate pencils, the soft scratching sound filling the room like the music of crickets. Ida would walk slowly up and down the aisle, pausing to correct a math problem here or adjust a pencil grip there. Out on the dusty road, a wagon might pass, its driver calling a friendly hello. There was no clock on the wall, so she measured time by the deepening gold of the light and the gradually increasing restlessness of her smallest pupils. When she finally rang the little bell to signal the end of the school day, the children would pour out into the sunshine like water released from a pitcher, their laughter ringing through the clearing. When the last child had disappeared down the road, Ida would stay behind in the empty schoolhouse. The silence was deep and profound, broken only by the ticking of the cooling stove or the flutter of a bird in the eaves. She would use this time to prepare the next day's lessons, carefully writing out arithmetic problems on the chalkboard in her elegant, flowing script. She would sharpen the quills, refill the ink pots, and wipe down the benches with a damp cloth. But she also used this time for herself. From her satchel, she would pull out a newspaper, often weeks old, and read every word. The news from Memphis and Chicago spoke of a larger world, of a burgeoning fight for civil rights, of women organizing. Sitting at that pine desk in the fading light, she felt a restless stirring in her soul, a quiet voice telling her that the schoolhouse, though a place of honor, might not be her only destiny. Her weekends were spent back in Holly Springs, where she took on the role of mother and father to her siblings. The work of keeping house was ceaseless, but she performed it with the same quiet dignity she brought to the classroom. She would do the family washing in the yard, a large iron pot bubbling over an open fire as she scrubbed the clothes against a washboard. She mended trousers, planted a kitchen garden with turnip greens and sweet potatoes, and balanced the household ledger. On Saturday evenings, she read the Bible to the younger children, her voice carrying the same soothing cadence her father's had. The siblings would fall asleep one by one, and she would finally sit by the window under the light of a single candle, her body weary, but her mind wide awake, thinking of editorials she wanted to write and injustices she wanted to address. The years of teaching in the country school polished Ida B. Wells into a woman of extraordinary resolve. The wood of her desk was worn smooth by her own elbows, the chalkboard etched with the ghostly residue of 1,000 lessons. She saved her meager teacher's salary, waiting for the moment she could expand her world. In the early 1880s, that moment arrived. She accepted an invitation from an aunt to move to the bustling river city of Memphis, Tennessee, and take a teaching position there. Packing her satchel and saying goodbye to the children in the little clearing was bittersweet. She knew she was leaving behind an innocent, sunlit chapter of her life. As the cart carried her away from the schoolhouse for the last time, she looked back and saw the afternoon light resting softly on its roof, a peaceful sanctuary that had held her first great calling. Memphis awaited, a city of bridges and steamboats, of brick-paved streets, and a vibrant African-American community. The countryside faded into the rearview mirror as the train carried her north, and her heart beat with quiet anticipation. She still carried the simple values of that wooden schoolhouse, the patience to listen, the discipline to prepare, and the courage to speak clearly. Those gifts, nurtured in the dappled light of a rural classroom, were about to be tested in ways she could never have imagined. As the train click-clacked over the iron rails and the sun set over the Mississippi Delta, painting the sky in ribbons of orange and purple, Ida B. Wells closed her eyes and rested. The quiet schoolteacher was heading into a new chapter, carrying her small satchel and her large, unspoken purpose. Memphis in the 1880s was a city of river mist and red brick, a bustling port on the Mississippi River where steamboats sounded their deep, throaty whistles day and night. Ida B. Wells arrived in this new urban landscape with her teacher's certificate and a quiet determination. She settled into a boarding house run by her aunt, a stately two-story building on a tree-lined street. Her room was small but comfortable, furnished with a spindle bed, a washstand with a porcelain basin, and, most importantly, a writing desk placed directly beneath a window that overlooked a garden. In the early mornings, she would sit at this desk and write in her journal, the light streaming through the lace curtains and casting a delicate pattern on the page. Downstairs, the scent of biscuits and bacon would drift up from the kitchen, and she could hear the street vendors beginning their calls, fresh eggs, and strawberries, ripe strawberries. She was a schoolteacher again, but Memphis was starting to whisper to her about a different path. To travel between the school where she taught and the city proper, Ida often took the train. One afternoon in 1884, after a long day of teaching, she boarded a train of the Chesapeake, Ohio, and Southwestern Railroad and chose a seat in the ladies' car. She was wearing a long, navy blue dress and a small hat, and she carried a book to read during the journey. Sunlight reflected off the polished brass luggage racks, and the plush velvet seats smelled faintly of steam and leather. She settled in, opened her book, and let the rhythm of the wheels relax her. The conductor approached, a stern man in a dark uniform, and informed her that this car was for white ladies only. She would have to move to the smoking car. Ida looked up calmly, marked her page, and refused. She had purchased a first-class ticket, and this was the first-class ladies' car. Her voice was quiet but steady as she asked why she should be forced to sit among cigar smoke and rough language simply because of her skin color. The scene that followed was unseemly, but through it, Ida remained a study in dignified resistance. When the conductor tried to physically drag her from the seat, she bit his hand. It was not an act of violence, but of righteous defiance. Eventually, 2 other men were brought in, and she was forcibly removed from the train, her dress torn, her small hat knocked askew. The passengers watched, some with sympathy, others with cold indifference. Standing on the platform as the train pulled away, she could see the departing wheels churning up dust on the rails. The late afternoon light seemed a little duller then, but inside her chest burned a clarity she had never felt before. She did not weep or wail. She returned to the boarding house, sat at her writing desk under the lace curtain, and began to draft a detailed account of the event. Ida was a teacher of grammar and logic, and now she employed both in a letter to a newspaper, laying out the injustice with surgical precision. Soon, her account was not just a letter, it became a legal battle. She hired an attorney and sued the railroad company. In the local circuit court, she won her case, and the courtroom gallery erupted in quiet, respectful applause. Though the Tennessee Supreme Court would later overturn the ruling, the initial victory had already singed itself into her soul. She had discovered the immense power of the written word. Sitting in her room at night, she would write articles by lamplight, her pen scratching across the paper as the city of Memphis quietly hummed outside her window. The bells of the riverboats felt like a punctuation to her sentences. She began to contribute regularly to a small, church-affiliated newspaper called The Living Way, using the pseudonym Myola. Her voice under the pen name Myola was anything but anonymous. It was vivid, sharp, and deeply humane. She wrote about the conditions in the segregated schools, the quiet humiliation of Jim Crow laws, and the daily striving of Black women. Her editorials were passed from hand to hand in barbershops and ladies' parlors. Her teacher's salary was spent on paper and ink. Eventually, the lure of journalism grew too strong to be a side pursuit. She was offered a part ownership in a small newspaper called the Memphis Free Speech and Headlight. The office was a humble, ground-floor space on a quiet street, with a large plate-glass window that let in the friendly morning light. The centerpiece of the room was a cast-iron Washington hand press, a hulking piece of machinery with a great iron wheel that smelled of ink and oil. Ida would stand at the composing table, selecting type from the wooden California job case, her fingers turning black with ink as she assembled the words that would shape the city's conscience. The printing office had its own distinct rhythm, a slow, hypnotic pulse that could soothe the most anxious mind. In the afternoons, light would pour through the dusty window, illuminating the stacks of newsprint piled against the exposed brick walls. The press itself, when in operation, made a deep, steady clanking sound, a heartbeat for the written word. Ida, now the editor, would proofread a freshly pulled copy, smelling the damp ink as she scanned for errors. She filled the pages of the Free Speech with calls for Black economic empowerment and civic engagement. Outside, the street life of Beale Avenue murmured, a guitar playing somewhere in the distance, the nicker of a horse tied to a post, the smell of smoke and cooking molasses. In this small, industrious sanctuary, she was no longer just a teacher or a plaintiff. She was a molder of public thought, a keeper of a quiet but persistent flame. Life found a contented cadence. She became close friends with a circle of like-minded activists and business owners, including a charismatic grocery store owner named Thomas Moss. The small community thrived in the face of segregation. On Sunday afternoons, after church services, Ida would walk through the parks, the air thick with the scent of magnolia blossoms. She would attend literary society meetings where men and women discussed Shakespeare and politics in the same breath. It was a world built on grace and intellect, a civilization within a civilization. The light in these scenes was always golden and warm, the laughter genuine. There is no hint, in the serene swish of her long skirts as she greets friends on a boardwalk, that a storm is gathering just beyond the horizon. For now, there is only the satisfying smell of fresh newspaper ink and the gentle promise of the Memphis River breeze. But the world tends to intrude upon such enclaves. In the quiet of her office, as the sun set and the gas lamps began to hiss softly on their brackets, Ida would sometimes pause in her writing and look out at the street. She could see the lamplighter making his rounds, a long pole touching each lamp and bringing forth a small, warm glow. She understood, perhaps deeper than most, that these individual lights were fragile, that they could be extinguished by a strong wind. Her pen hovered over the page, and she wrote a line about vigilance, about the necessity of holding the lantern high. In the stillness of her empty office, surrounded by the scent of ink and the silent iron press, she felt a profound connection to her purpose. She was ready, though she did not yet know it, to raise her voice against a darkness that would shake her city and send her out into the world as a voice of the voiceless. There are moments in history when a single act of violence cracks the surface of the world and a deep, cold darkness seems to seep through. Such a moment arrived in the spring of 1892. In a mixed-race neighborhood on the outskirts of Memphis, 3 young black businessmen, Thomas Moss, Calvin McDowell, and Will Stewart, owned a thriving grocery store named the People's Grocery. They were friends of Ida, members of the same close-knit community that had built a world of dignity and commerce. The store stood on a dusty curve of road under the shade of an old oak tree, a place where neighbors gathered to buy molasses, exchange news, and laugh in the dusk. But a competing white-owned store across the street had grown resentful of their success. A dispute erupted, and after a series of escalating tensions, a mob descended upon the small grocery. In the subsequent days, the 3 men were dragged from their cells in the jailhouse and murdered, their bodies left as a grim warning under the moonlight. The city of Memphis awoke to a hush of complicity. Ida B. Wells, sitting at her desk in the Free Speech office, received the news like a physical blow. The lamplight flickered, as if the flame itself felt the weight of the sorrow. She had known Thomas Moss personally. He was a kind man, a father, a Sunday school teacher. The pages of her newspaper lay blank before her, but inside her mind, the words were already forming, crystallizing out of grief and a cold, righteous anger. She did not sleep that night. She walked the streets of her adopted city, past the shuttered windows and the silent churches, the hem of her dress damp with dew. The oil-fueled street lamps cast small pools of orange light on the cobblestones, and she moved from one pool to the next, her shadow stretching and shrinking. By the time the sun rose, she had made a decision. She would write a piece that would challenge not just the lynchers, but the silence that protected them. Her editorial, published in the Free Speech on May 21, 1892, was like a solemn bell rung in an empty hall. With her editor's blue pencil, she had crafted sentences that were as factual as they were incendiary. She dissected the lie that lynching was a response to criminal assault, arguing instead that it was an act of economic terrorism used to suppress Black prosperity. Her words were not shouted in capital letters. They were delivered in a calm, devastating whisper that could be heard across the country. The paper sold out instantly. The copies were passed over backyard fences and across kitchen tables. Some people read them aloud on street corners. A strange, electric stillness settled over the city, the kind that comes before a lightning strike. Ida, watching from her office window, saw people gathered in small, quiet groups, nodding gravely as they read. She knew she had struck something true, and she also knew that truth often brings a storm. While Ida was away on a trip to Philadelphia, the storm broke. A mob of angry white citizens, enraged by her editorial, gathered in the streets and marched to the offices of the Free Speech. They shattered the plate glass window that had let in so much friendly morning light and ransacked the interior. They smashed the cast-iron press, that old iron heart that had beaten out the rhythm of justice, destroying the type cases and scattering the precious metal letters on the floor like seeds. The building was stripped bare, and signs were posted warning her never to return. When the news reached Ida, she was sitting in a hotel room in a strange city, a cup of cold tea untouched on the table. The afternoon light through the lace curtains was the same color it had always been, but it felt different now, more fragile. She realized she had become an exile, her means of livelihood destroyed, her name on a death list. But she did not weep. She took out a fresh sheet of hotel stationery, and she began to write again. New York City became her refuge. A sprawling metropolis of towering brownstones and clattering elevated trains, it was a world away from the magnolias of Memphis. She arrived at Grand Central Terminal, a single woman with a leather satchel, her entire life now compressed into a few notebooks and a pen she had salvaged. The noise and steam of the city did not overwhelm her. They cocooned her, granting her anonymity. Black leaders in the city, including the aging lion of abolition, Frederick Douglass, welcomed her. She visited him in his stately home, where a fire crackled in the grate and books were stacked on every surface. The old man had a mane of white hair and a voice like rumbling thunder, but in her presence, he was gentle, a wise grandfather figure. He looked at this young woman from the South, saw the fire in her eyes, and lent his name to her cause. Together, they planned a strategy to take her words to audiences in England and across the North. During this period of exile, Ida transformed her grief into one of the first great investigative journalism projects in American history. She traveled alone to various cities, sitting in dusty courthouses, interviewing eyewitnesses, and poring over newspaper morgues. She began compiling her research into a pamphlet titled Southern Horrors, Lynch Law in All Its Phases. In the quiet of a library, with a green-shaded gas lamp burning low over the polished oak table, she assembled a mosaic of heartbreaking facts. The scratch of her pen was the only sound. She documented names and dates, exposed the economic underpinnings of mob violence, and gave dignity to the dead. The work was exhausting, but she approached it like a historian and a weaver. Each verified fact was a thread. She was weaving a grand, dark tapestry meant to show the world exactly what was happening in the shadows of the cotton fields. Her crusade took her across the Atlantic to the cities of England and Scotland. On those voyages, the steamship cut through the gray, rolling sea, and Ida would stand at the railing, watching the horizon. The air was clean and cold, so different from the humid thickness of Memphis. In Liverpool and Manchester, she spoke in great halls built of stone, beneath high, vaulted ceilings. The light here was thin and northern, falling through stained glass windows in pale ribbons. Her voice, however, was the same calm, cutting instrument it had always been. She described the atrocities not with lurid detail, but with a quiet, sorrowful clarity that moved her British audiences to form an anti-lynching committee. Letters of support poured into the American press, embarrassing the political establishment. Half a world away from her destroyed printing press, she had found a new one, her own voice, amplified by the sympathy of strangers in a distant land. After 2 years of exile, Ida B. Wells returned to the United States, not to Memphis, but to Chicago. She stepped off the train in this new city as the sun was setting over the great western prairie, staining the sky a brilliant crimson. She was no longer just a journalist who owned a small paper. She was an international figure, a woman who had stared into the deepest darkness and refused to let her light go out. She carried with her the heavy, cherished manuscript of a second major work, The Red Record, a meticulous statistical treatise on lynching. In the approaching twilight, the city of Chicago spread before her like a canvas. The smell of the Great Lake was in the air, fresh and promising. She adjusted her hat, picked up her satchel, and walked down the platform, each step steady and sure. The quiet exile had ended. The work of building a new life was about to begin. Chicago in the mid-1890s was a city rising from its own ashes, rebuilding itself after the Great Fire into a marvel of American architecture and ambition. For Ida B. Wells, who had spent years in rented boarding houses and hotel rooms, this city offered the possibility of a true home. She found a comfortable apartment on the South Side, an area where a growing Black professional class was putting down deep roots. Her new home was located on a quiet, tree-lined street, a red brick building with wide windows that faced east, toward the vast, shimmering expanse of Lake Michigan. Every morning, the sunrise would reflect on the lake's surface, sending a soft, pearly light into her living space. The apartment smelled of fresh paint and floor wax. Here, amidst her unpacked boxes of pamphlets and her beloved books, she began to allow herself something she had not enjoyed since childhood, a sense of rootedness, of stillness. The lake breeze, cool and clean, gently moved the curtains, and the distant sound of foghorns from the harbor became the lullaby of her new life. It was here that she met Ferdinand L. Barnett, a highly respected attorney, editor, and widower with 2 young children. Their courtship was not a loud, dramatic affair, but rather a quiet convergence of 2 like-minded souls. Ferdinand ran the Chicago Conservator, a Black-owned newspaper, and he understood the demands of her calling. They would often sit together on a park bench overlooking the lake, watching the sailboats drift lazily across the blue water. The grass around them was a lush green, and the paths were dotted with couples strolling under elm trees. They spoke of law, of politics, of how to build a just society, but also of simpler things, of favorite poems, of the way the light changed on the water at dusk. Ferdinand saw not just the fierce journalist, but the woman who loved gardens and classical music. On a mild spring afternoon, with the scent of lilac in the air and the gentle lapping of the waves as witness, he asked her to marry him. She said yes, and the sunlight seemed to grow just a little warmer. Their wedding took place in Chicago in 1895, a ceremony filled with the warmth of family and the quiet elegance of the era. In the photographs taken that day, Ida wears a high-necked, dark silk dress with tight sleeves and a small corsage of flowers, her expression serene and self-possessed. They made their home a true partnership. She became a stepmother to his 2 children, and she would eventually have 4 children of her own. Their house, a stately Victorian home on what is now Martin Luther King Drive, became a sanctuary. The interior was a study in cultivated comfort, a grand fireplace with a carved wooden mantel, shelves lining every wall, a piano in the corner where daughter Ida would one day practice her scales. The smell of beeswax polish and fresh-cut flowers from the garden filled the rooms. It was a house of order, of scheduled meal times and gentle discipline, but also of deep intellectual ferment. Famous visitors, scholars, activists, artists, would sit in the parlor, discussing the events of the day over cups of tea. Despite the joys of matrimony and motherhood, Ida never truly halted her public work. Her home simply became the new base of operations. She had an upstairs study, a room of her own with a solid oak desk positioned directly beneath a window. In this room, she kept her typewriter, a newfangled machine that she operated with surprising speed. The rhythmic clicking of the keys became a familiar background sound in the household, a sign that mother was working. She would sit at the desk, her youngest child sometimes playing quietly with blocks on the rug beside her, and write pamphlets, letters, and editorials. The light in the study was always soft, filtered through the leaves of a maple tree just outside, making shifting patterns on the manuscript pages. She balanced her checkbook with the same meticulous care she used to deconstruct a false statistic, and she taught her children that intellectual labor and domestic responsibility were not opposing forces, but two parts of a well-lived life. The city of Chicago offered a new kind of battlefield for civil rights, and Ida navigated it with the same grace and force she had brought to her anti-lynching crusade. She focused on the local community, founding the first kindergarten for Black children in the city and organizing women into powerful clubs. She was a central figure in the founding of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, a federation that combined the push for suffrage with the practical work of building community centers. On a summer afternoon, you could find her on the front porch of her home, chairing a meeting of the club's planning committee. The women would sit in a circle of wicker chairs, the air filled with the buzz of bees and the scent of the rose bushes that lined the porch. They poured lemonade from a crystal pitcher, their voices a thoughtful murmur as they planned libraries and daycare centers. The golden afternoon light filtered through the porch vines, dappling their long skirts and earnest faces. Travel, however, continued to call to her. Her children would sometimes awaken to find their mother had boarded a morning train to Springfield to lobby the state legislature, or to Washington, D.C. to pressure a president. But she always returned with a small gift and a story. The train stations of the early 1900s held a particular romance. The high, arched ceilings of the great terminals, the steam curling around the locomotive wheels, the cry of the conductor. Ida would step down from the train, tired but fulfilled, her leather satchel stuffed with notes. Ferdinand, dignified in his pinstripe suit, would be waiting on the platform to drive her home in their automobile. The drive back through the tree-lined boulevards, the windows rolled down to let in the evening air, was their debriefing time. She would talk about the day's battles, and he would listen, his hand resting on the steering wheel. The street lamps would begin to flicker on, illuminating the safe passage home. Family life followed the slow, measured rhythms of the seasons. In the autumn, the children would play in piles of copper-colored leaves that had fallen from the maple in the front yard, their laughter ringing out on the crisp air. In the winter, the home glowed from within, a warm island in a sea of Chicago snow. The family would gather around the fireplace, roasting chestnuts and reading aloud from novels or the Bible. Ida, wrapped in a woolen shawl, would look at the faces of her children in the firelight and feel a profound sense of peace, a peace hard-won, built on the bones of a destroyed press and the memory of lost friends. Springtime brought the garden to life. She planted hollyhocks and snapdragons, her hands in the dark, fragrant soil, the sun warm on the back of her neck. It was in these quiet, domestic scenes, in the simple act of nurturing a living thing, that she replenished her spirit. As the new century unfolded, the world outside her warm Chicago home was rapidly changing. The telephone began to ring in the front hallway, and electric lights replaced the gas lamps. Through it all, the house on the south side remained a constant, a place where the light from the lake was a daily benediction. Ida B. Wells, the radical exile, had become a matriarch, a neighbor, a respected fixture of her community. But the fire that had driven her to sue a railroad and flee a mob still burned brightly within her. It was simply channeled into new rivers. The same pen that had documented lynchings now sketched out the plans for a women's suffrage parade route. As she stood by her wide window at dusk, watching the dying light turn the lake into a sheet of rose-colored glass, she knew that for all the tranquility of her current life, a new wave of struggle, the fight for the vote, was just beginning to crest. The early morning light in Chicago has a particular clarity, a crisp, silver-gold quality that hovers over the lake and spills into the quiet streets. In the early years of the 20th century, this light often found Ida B. Wells walking from her front door with a parasol in hand and a determined stride. She was moving into a new phase of her fight, one that would connect the work she had done for racial justice with the rising tide of the women's suffrage movement. She firmly believed that the ballot was a tool for protection, for a community disarmed of its legal and economic rights. In her view, The right of women to vote was not just an abstract ideal of equality, it was a practical necessity for Black women seeking to protect their families from violence and injustice. She joined the Illinois Equal Suffrage Association, her deep, calm voice adding a rich, undeniable moral dimension to the meetings held in clubs and parlors across the city. The suffrage movement of the time, however, was not always a sanctuary of sisterhood. Even among those fighting for their own rights, the color line persisted. Ida found herself organizing the Alpha Suffrage Club, the first Black women's suffrage group in Illinois, where she could speak freely and strategize without the sting of exclusion. The club met in a warm, welcoming room in a South Side settlement house. The walls were painted a soft cream color, and the wooden chairs were arranged in a friendly circle. In the center of the table, a vase held fresh-cut daffodils. Ida would stand before these women who cleaned houses, raised families, and survived, and she would teach them parliamentary procedure and political philosophy with the same patience she had once shown the students in her rural Mississippi schoolhouse. The scent of the daffodils mixed with the smell of coffee brewing in the back room, and, through the open window, the sounds of the city, clopping horses and distant streetcars, provided a gentle backdrop to their powerful planning sessions. A critical moment arrived in 1913, when the nation's capital prepared to host a massive suffrage parade on the eve of Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. Thousands of women in white dresses, carrying banners and riding floats, would march down Pennsylvania Avenue. Ida B. Wells traveled to Washington with a small contingent from her Chicago club to join the Illinois state delegation. The morning of the parade was cool and crisp, the sky a pale, washed blue above the marble domes and monuments of the city. The women gathered at the staging area, pinning on their sashes and adjusting their gloves. But then word came from the parade's white organizers. The Black women were to be segregated to the back of the march. The excuse was that the Southern delegations might walk out. Standing amidst the flurry of white fabric and fluttering banners, Ida felt the same chill she had felt on that train car in Memphis. Ida refused to stay at the back. She and a few of her allies formed a quiet, dignified plan. As the parade stepped off, with the crowds lining the avenue and flags whipping in the breeze, the Illinois delegation began to move forward. At the opportune moment, as the marchers passed by a swell of spectators, Ida simply slipped from the curb and fell into line with her white Illinois sisters, right where she belonged, at the front of history. She was dressed in a long white coat and a dark hat, her expression calm and resolute. The crowd may not have known her name, but they saw a woman who seemed to embody the very spirit of the march. The sound of the drums and the marching feet became a steady heartbeat. In that long, slow walk down the nation's Grand Avenue, with the Capitol building looming before her, she was not a guest in the House of Equality. She was a builder of its foundations. Back home in Chicago, the rhythms of her later years settled into a quieter, but no less profound, cadence. Her garden grew deeper and more tangled, a beautiful, wild sanctuary of hollyhocks, climbing roses, and irises. She could often be found there in the late afternoon, a straw hat shading her face, a trowel in her gloved hand. The rich, dark earth soaked up the water she poured from a copper watering can, and the scent was deeply green and alive. The garden was her meditation, a place where the injustices of the world could be held at bay by a hedge of blooming hydrangeas. Her children had grown, and now grandchildren chased butterflies along the stone pathways. Watching them, she thought of her own parents, of the little house in Holly Springs, of the long, incredible arc of a life lived entirely in the service of justice. She continued to write until the very end, her words now focused on her autobiography, Crusade for Justice. In her upstairs study, now surrounded by photographs of her family and mementos from her travels to England and Niagara Falls, she typed out her story. The act of remembrance was, for her, a final act of teaching. She wanted future generations to know not just the names of the martyrs, but the strategies of the resistance. Her typewriter keys struck the paper with a slower rhythm now, her fingers a little stiffer with age, but the clarity of her mind remained as sharp as her editor's blue pencil. She would work until the sunset filled her window with a blaze of orange, and then she would close the cover of the machine gently, as if putting a child to sleep. The last years of her life were spent in the embrace of her family and the esteem of her community. The house on the south side remained a place of light and gathering. On Sunday afternoons, the family would assemble in the dining room, a space filled with the warm aroma of roasted chicken and the shine of silverware on a white linen tablecloth. Through the window, the emerald green of the lawn stretched toward the lake. After dinner, they might gather in the parlor around the piano, singing hymns and spirituals. Ida would sit in her favorite wingback chair, her hands folded in her lap, a faint smile on her lips. Her voice, which had once shouted down mobs and moved parliaments, was now a soft, gravelly alto, blending peacefully with those of her children and grandchildren. The lamp on the side table cast a golden circle of light that held the family close. Ida B. Wells passed away on March 25, 1931, with the spring rains beginning outside her window. The world beyond was a tangle of Great Depression and gathering storms, but in her room, there was only stillness and a deep, abiding peace. The legacy she left was not just in the laws she helped change or the organizations she founded, but in the light she had brought to the darkest corners of American life. She had shown that a single, committed voice, speaking the truth with calm precision, could shake the foundations of power. In the garden of the house on the south side, the tulips she had planted were just beginning to push their bright green shoots through the dark, warming soil. The rain fell gently, tapping against the window panes, a soft lullaby for a life well lived. As the dusk gathered over the great lake, the light that had guided her all those years, the light of justice, the light of family, the light of the written word, did not go out, but simply passed into the keeping of all who would follow.